directly to the front, you can do the final.
You have to be aggressive. If you're not aggressive, you're not in the race.
Is it a little bit uncomfortable that you've got guys that people say, we don't really like the fact that you've got this ex-doper on your team and so on and so forth? Yes, that's extremely uncomfortable.
I'm very busy, but I always find a little bit of time for our listeners, for you.
With exclusive interviews and the best analysis on two wheels, this is the Telegraph Cycling Podcast.
Hello, I'm Lionel Birnie. I'm with Daniel Friebe.
Hello, Lionel.
No Richard Moore this week. He is on holiday, so off the substitutes bench is Rob Hatch. Hello, Rob.
Hello, how are we going?
Very good. 2 weeks running. He stood in for me last week, standing in for Richard this week. They're not feeling the pressure at all?
No, but I'm off on holiday myself this week. Obviously, I need one after the last 2 weeks.
Well, and Daniel, you're off somewhere. There's going to be nobody left to do the cycling podcast at this rate. Hopefully, we'll rope in some more stand-ins in the coming weeks. So, today's episode of the cycling podcast will be addressing the start of the Vuelta a Espana, the third and final Grand Tour of the season underway. 2 stages have happened so far. No shortage of controversy. We've had 3 weeks' worth of controversy in the opening weekend. What else has been going on? There's been the US Pro Challenge in Colorado, which Rob has been paying particular attention to, or at least his commentary has given us the impression that he's paid particular attention to that on British Eurosport. There was also the Vattenfalls Cyclassics, the predominantly flat UCI World Tour race in Hamburg, won by Andre Greipel. Popular win for the German rider on home soil there. But really, it's the Vuelta that is dominating everything at the moment and will do for the next 3 weeks. But the start of the Vuelta, it certainly attracted a lot of attention. To recap what happened on Saturday, the very controversial team time trial from Puerto Banús to Marbella. The sort of night spot, holiday maker, capital of the Costa del Sol. Ever been there, anyone?
Well, I was at the route presentation, of course, in Marbella. It was actually in Torremolinos last winter. And yeah, this prologue team time trial opening stage was unveiled amid much fanfare, but it turned out to be a bit of a shambles. But I said it was last winter. I think it was actually January when the route was unveiled, and here we are 9 months later. Plenty of time. All of the the stakeholders, we hate that word, but they've had plenty of time to think about this, look at the route, assess the implications of the riding on 5 different surfaces. Javier Guillen, the director of the Vuelta a España, it's funny, at the start of last week he was very proud of the fact that this first stage was going to go over 5 different surfaces. So there was, sand, cinder. We speculated that they might be riding over water at one point, but anyway, it soon had transitioned, or his mood and what he was saying about it, in the space of about 4 days, to being very sheepish from being very proud of it. And it was a complete shambles, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, you mentioned that about people having plenty of time. Once the route is announced at the start of the year, they have got 8 and a bit months to check it out. But of course, unlike the Tour de France, where the top teams and riders all go and check out the key stages, no one really does that for the Vuelta or really for the Giro. And so it really hit a lot of the riders when they arrived on the Costa del Sol to see that this 7.4 kilometre stretch, parallel to the beach, most of it, went, as you say, Daniel, on sort of a sandy cycle path, which would be fine for a sort of higher bike, not necessarily for a low-profile time trial bike. I think they had some marble surface, which would have been treacherous had it rained, although not a lot of rain in that region this time of year. I think they had a wooden footbridge, didn't they? Which, again, it really did have a sort of wacky races quality. I watched it on Saturday, and it was unusual, not least because the brouhaha that blew up in the days before the race meant that a compromise was reached between the UCI officials, the race organisers and the teams, that the times wouldn't count for the overall individual classification. They did count for the stage win, of course, and for the red jersey, and they counted for the team's classification, but not for the overall standing. So really the Vuelta lost one of its stages, and with it lost a lot of the point of the exercise. Do you think, Rob?
I think so. I think it was just nothing short of a big farce, really. And it's a shame this year, a bit of a national embarrassment in Spain, because you can go all the way back to the Vuelta a Catalunya. You had the TV debacle. In the Basque Country, you had all the bad placement of the road furniture, and Peter Stettiner will tell you something about that after his horrific injury. San Sebastian the other week, not good with the TV images again, albeit there was a bit of an aviation emergency and all that sort of stuff that can't really be prevented, but a serious lack of a backup plan. We had Motorgate with Greg van Avermaet knocked off his bike when he was going to win that, and I'm afraid for my adopted compatriots it's a bit of an embarrassment, really. And Javier Guillén, I think there's a time now when things need to settle down a little. The Vuelta a España, we talked about this inferiority complex that it's obviously feeling. They need to stop being a little more serious, say, OK, perhaps the pressure's off now. Maybe the UCI could help there and say to them, hang on, we're not going to take your third week away from you, because there's been a lot of rumblings in the calendar in the last few years. You know, the Vuelta's too long, we don't need 3 Grand Tours, certainly this long anyway. All Grand Tours maybe should be 2 weeks. There's a lot of different schools of thought going along, and I know there's a lot of, again, stakeholders with their particular views on that one. But I think, yeah, the UCI could help say, OK, no, don't worry, you're going to be a 3-week race, we're going to keep you, you're an important historic race, and Javier Guillén and the rest could just settle down, organise a bike race like we expect it to be organised, safe, yeah, fun, interesting parkour, but Saturday was a little too much, wasn't it?
Rob talked about the inferiority complex and almost cycling's lack of confidence, not just the Vuelta's lack of confidence, but cycling's lack of confidence. We saw this a few years ago with the Giro d'Italia. Again, was feeling very threatened by the Tour de France. His best riders were all going to the Tour. Well, they always have done and will continue to do. And there was a period where the Giro was really trying desperately to elevate itself. And when Angelo Zomagnan was at the helm of the Giro with the phenomenon that we referred to at the time as cicloalpinismo, it was more like rock climbing than cycling, with stages like Plan de Corones. You know, it was a ski resort, and they just laid down some cement and basically turned it into a sort of a gimmicky uphill time trial, and this carried on for a few years with the Giro, and now the Giro has finally realised, subsequent to complaints of riders and a few embarrassing situations like the one we saw at the Vuelta last week, that really it just needs to concentrate on being a bike race, and it has enough to attract all the attention it needs to attract. And you know, I think, as I said, cycling in general suffers from a bit of a lack of confidence and this kind of exasperated quest to grow the pie and become richer and attract more money and give itself a different dimension and promote tourist destinations, etc. And really, you know, the reason that people watch cycling is the race in itself, and just have faith in the fact that, you know, if we build it, people will come. Build it as in, you build just a good bike race
as a credible sporting event rather than a kind of an artificially created spectacle. I mean, the paradox is, of course, that this has been a great big talking point for cycling. A lot of activity on social media, which I'm sure the marketing men will have taken notice of. Of course, as soon as the riders arrived, they started taking photos of the surface, and I think Christian Knies of the Sky team mocked up a sort of holiday brochure, which was very, very creative, very inventive. You can probably find that on his Twitter feed. And the riders, I think Joe Dombrowski's father texted him, this is the Cannondale Garmin rider, texted him a picture of some flip-flops and said, I've got your shoes ready for stage 1. So there was a bit of fun had there, but of course once they neutralised it and meant that the teams didn't have to risk their necks, which obviously, you know, nobody wanted to see any of the riders sort of slide out on the sand, go down at 45, 50k an hour, and you can look at the results and see Team Sky, for example, just rode round really, finished third from last. They had nothing to lose. They certainly weren't going to go all out for the stage win. BMC Racing did go all out for the stage win and beat Tinkoff Saxo by a second, put Peter Velits into the leader's red jersey. So some teams did, you know, make a race of it, but it left a bit of a, as you say, Rob, a bit of a farcical feeling, and gets the Grand Tour off to a bit of a shaky start, and then even more controversy on Sunday. I mean, a stage which, from start to finish, really, a very bad crash in the first third of the race, which left Paolo Tirolongo of Astana with some terrible facial injuries, but you know, it's almost like Saturday's fast sort of set the tone for yet more controversy.
Oh, it's funny, I was listening to the Spanish radio last night, and then the presenter, first thing he said to Javier Guillén was, well, what's happened today? And then the next thing he moved on to, tomorrow can we have a normal day? He was asking for a quiet day, for a day where we have normal bike racing, no silly incidents. Yeah, we had this bizarre incident where we had all the nasty crash and what have you, and unfortunately we've learned already that there's been a broken pelvis for David Tanner, a really nasty injury as well, concussion to, I think it was Przemysław Niemiec, the Polish rider from Lampre Merida. I know that as we talk on a Monday morning here, he's going for more examinations, but they've diagnosed concussion so far for him. So 2 riders already out the race. We already lost Matteo Pelucchi as well from Yam Cycling to a crash earlier on in the day. But when we resumed racing after the crash, we had this incident where Vincenzo Nibali, on the television at first look, to those who weren't perhaps as eagle-eyed as others, it looked like a fantastic bit of racing to get back in, to make the final climb. And once we got to the final climb, yeah, he lost a bit of time, but quite a few other riders doing the same, the likes of Froome, Valverde, Joaquim Rodriguez as well. The stage winner at the end of it was Esteban Chavez, the young Colombian from Orica Green Edge. Brilliant end to a stage that was really well thought out, with a resurgent Tom Dumoulin back as well, the Dutch rider, after his nasty injury in the Tour. He's been to altitude, so he's found some form at just the right time. Also up there was Nicolas Roche as well from Team Sky. Great ride from him, just covering the attacks, explaining that Chris Froome, with 4 kilometres to go, gave him the freedom to cover those attacks. And Sky rode fairly well as well with Geraint Thomas. I think the image that we're going to have of him in this third Grand Tour of the year, he's going to be doing his work quite a lot earlier, getting it out of the way, swinging off and just getting through it. But aside from the stage win, the big talk was Vincenzo Nibali, later discovered to be holding on to a car, moving away from a group of around 30-40 riders that had been dropped, and either he had a bit of a turbocharge in his pedalling, or his hands were firmly fixed with superglue to the side of the Astana car, discovered after the race and subsequently kicked out.
It's great the way Hatch gives all this context, and he basically told the whole story of the stage. We would have just said Nibali was cheated and he got kicked out and he got red carded,
and we could have gone for lunch.
Yeah, we could have gone for a pint. But that is essentially what happened, wasn't it? He got kicked out. Big controversy, deserved penalty. I think we all agree that he was banged to rights. Fairly sheepish apology was issued that evening or yesterday evening on Facebook, and really there's not much to be said about the merits of the sanction, except that there's this inconsistency that blights professional cycling. I mean, I looked at the UCI regulations this morning, and Nibali himself pointed out that this kind of infringement goes unnoticed so often in cycling, and really there should be an asterisk and there should be a caveat added to almost every one of these infringements in the UCI regulations, saying you're not allowed to do certain things as if you're being filmed, if you're being seen by TV cameras, because and so many races in cycling aren't televised particularly well, certainly not to the extent that the Vuelta is, with I don't know how many TV motorbikes. Rob would probably know better than us, and there's so much latitude for this kind of thing to go on. But Nibali was unfortunate enough yesterday to be filmed by an overhead TV camera. Probably didn't imagine that he was going to be filmed, and consequently he left the UCI commissaires with no choice, did he?
Absolutely no choice, really. I mean, again, we touched on this during the tour, didn't we? The great unwritten rules of professional cycling, and we came down really, I think Richard, Daniel, we're all in agreement really that if the rules aren't written down, then they're not rules. I mean, this whole business about when a race is neutralised, or when certain things should or shouldn't happen, what's right, what's not right, where the line is. The difficulty is, I mean, I've been in team cars where I've seen riders with the old sticky bottle, and you think that's gone on a bit too long now, but you're at the back of the race maybe, or a rider's had a very long, abnormally long wheel change, for example, and the car will take them back up to the group they were in, and that the blind eye is turned. And if you want to call it an unwritten rule, the unwritten rule is that the rider will be allowed to hold on to usually it's done just holding onto the side of the car, but the sticky bottle is when the sports director holds the water bottle out of the window, or an energy gel or something, and the rider takes a long time to take hold of it and release the hand, and he's getting a toe back up. But I mean, I've been in a team car in a classic Ghent Wevelgem where we're in the break behind, there were a few riders up the road, and at the back of that group of 12, 15 riders, say, riders would drop back to talk to the sports director and would hold on to the car for a couple of minutes whilst rolling along. You know, they're in the last 50k of the race, they're getting a tow for a couple of minutes, every little helps. You know, these things do happen all the time in every race. And so it's not that what Nibali did was particularly unusual, although it was a real blatant one, wasn't it? He's holding onto the car, accelerating away.
Yeah, 40 riders, yeah. I think if he'd have been on his own at the back, you also wouldn't have seen the difference in acceleration between the two groups, I think, and it would have gone probably unnoticed. But the fact that he's gone away from 40 riders in a quite farcical way, I mean, it's almost humorous, comedic watching it. It was... I mean, I found it quite funny watching it 4 or 5 times. Then you realise how serious it is, the fact that he has cheated. And it's interesting as well that the organisers, I don't think, wanted to throw him out. There was a meeting yesterday, 45 minutes to an hour between the commissars. They'd had the information passed to them. They didn't see it in the race. And when he went public with it yesterday, the organiser, Guillaume, was saying, well, the first question he was asked, funnily enough, was not whether he thought he deserved to be going out, but how did you get those images? And I think it was a sort of online vigilantism of everybody passing the video around, and it got to the commissars. They saw it. 45 minutes looking at the rules, thinking, is there another solution to this? Javier Guillén said, well, his choice of words was really interesting. The commissars had no choice but to apply that sanction. That's what's in the rules. I think everybody, in terms of the publicity of the race and everyone around the race, would prefer to have given him 10 minutes and let him come in. But the rules, thankfully, in this case, are clear. Expulsion. And as you were about to say, I think, Daniel, that it was really, really clear.
Well, yeah, I mean, just to... you said, Lionel, the problem really was how flagrant it was. And, you know, the rule, like I said, there almost should be an asterisk and a footnote. Don't get caught, don't be seen, and don't take the piss, really. And he did both things. But in sympathy and in mitigation...
I'm not sure they use that language in the official UCI rules. Sorry about that, listeners.
Sorry about that. But in mitigation and in fairness to Nibali and to all the other riders, I would say it's very difficult for them when the application of the rules is so inconsistent. And it reminds me a lot of the situation we had in the 1990s with doping, and in particular the hematocrit limit. You know, you were allowed to cheat up to a certain point, and no one, well, there was a very arbitrary limit fixed there, which was 50%. With hematocrit, you were allowed to take EPO basically up to the level, up to the threshold of 50%, and the threshold with as far as taking tows and sheltering behind cars seems to be fixed at that point, at that threshold of not being seen, not being caught, and it is essentially a form of anarchy. And the only real way to resolve this would be an element of self-policing in the peloton and having a situation where riders call each other out. Can we really rely on that? Is it fair to rely on that? Is it realistic to rely on them to do that? You know, it was the reactions last night from riders were conspicuous by their absence, weren't they? There was very, very little on social media, and you know, I think deep down that's probably because most of the riders know that they've been guilty of this in the past, and it's something that they want to have the option of using at certain times.
Absolutely, the peloton is a jungle, and I think the attitude would be, if he gets away with that today, I might get away with that tomorrow when I need it.
British Eurosport, the home of cycling.
You can watch every stage of the Vuelta a Espana on British Eurosport with the commentary team of Carlton Kirby and Sean Kelly. And we may well be getting Sean Kelly on the podcast in the next couple of weeks to get his thoughts on the Vuelta, a race he won in 1988, of course. A long time ago now, but he remembers every detail very clearly. And he also remembers the 1987 Vuelta when he had to pull out very close to the end whilst wearing the leader's jersey, which was yellow in those days, not red. Had a very, very painful saddle boil, which they attempted to lance with a hot pin, I think it was. And I remember talking to him about this for his autobiography, and I asked, you know, what was it like? He said, yes, well, it did smart a bit. Anyway, I'm sure we'll get Sean to tell that story in a lot more funny way than I did just then, or a lot more gruesome detail, perhaps. But let's just go back to this issue with Vincenzo Nibali being thrown out of the Vuelta after really a day and 3/4 of racing. I was going to say, you know, the problem with the culture of cycle racing is that this business, as soon as riders have following cars, so from sort of serious junior races up, the sort of professionalism of riding in the cars is a skill in itself. Riding in the cars, using the cars, getting on the bumpers to get back up. And again, there's that grey line, isn't there, between sitting on the bumper for 20 minutes sometimes, or 10 minutes to get back up to a group, and using the cars to get in that way and actually holding on. And I think it's the flagrancy of Nibali's actions on Sunday that really left the organisers, the UCI commissaires, with no choice. And it brought back a memory of being in a team car at a Premier Calendar race in Britain a few years ago. I won't name names for a couple of reasons. I'll probably get accused of not naming names now, but it was just somebody trying to do their best, and he'd been dropped by not even the first group on the road.
This wasn't Richard Moore, was it?
It wasn't Richard Moore, although he would be ideal here today, wouldn't he? Because he did once get disqualified from the RAS in Ireland for holding onto a team car, didn't he? That more or less ended his I don't want to say blossoming amateur career here, but I also don't want to offend him too much when he's not here to defend himself.
There was also an incident where he hid behind a bush, wasn't there, and jumped out, an opportune moment. Anyway.
We need to return to this when Richard's here. Maybe do a Friends of the Podcast special on chicanery in cycling with Richard Moore. But yeah, in this Premier Calendar race, it wasn't Richard Moore, it was another rider. He'd been dropped by the second group on the road, but he said to his team manager, if you can get me back on here, meaning to the second group, I can finish in the top 10. And we basically drove at 50 miles an hour with him holding onto the side of the car door with the window wound down, and we got to the back of the group that he wanted to get into, which was probably about 10th to 20th riders on the road, and then 5 minutes later he punctured. So it was karma, really. So, but this issue, once the cars are on the race, you've got cars in amongst the riders. These things are always going to happen, aren't they?
They are, and if we want to create a situation where it's no longer tolerated, really it's going to take a long time, and there has to be a culture change, because there is a culture of unwritten rules in professional cycling, and it's always curious and just to observe and think about the different cultures that exist in different sports. You know, golf has a very hard-line view of cheating, any form of cheating, and people are ostracised and certainly called out by their peers and colleagues, and it can really blight someone's image for the duration of their career. And we've seen that, and there was an incident with Vijay Singh early in his career, and that really stuck with him for the rest of his time. Well, it just still lives with him today. And you know, you compare rugby as against professional football. In professional rugby, there's a culture whereby people don't argue with referees, but they very much do in football. You know, if people are going to throw their arms up at what happened yesterday or argue about whether it was right or wrong, then perhaps a serious discussion has to take place about, you know, are we going to continue to have this very ambiguous, nebulous culture situation in professional cycling whereby things are overlooked or they're tolerated, or you know, do we think this is a small beer compared to the main problem that cycling faces in terms of cheating, which is doping? Because that is essentially the view that cycling and the cycling public and the cycling, again that word, stakeholders take at the moment, that doping is beyond the pale, it's not going to be tolerated by in any shape or form, but there is a lower level of cheating which we're quite happy to overlook.
But when you look at how the sport is, and it's trying to attract more people to be interested in it, if you ask the average cycling fan, and if you look at sort of BuzzFeed type media coverage online, this is the sort of thing that will show up with a look what this crazy bike racer did in a bike race. Hey, he thought it would be cool to hang on to the side of a car. So you've got this difficulty. Anyone looking at that from the outside of cycling, not understanding what goes on, would think this is ridiculous. I mean, that's why they had to take such a line with Sepulveda in the Tour de France when he had a rush of blood to the head. It can only have been that, when he lost his cool, didn't know what to do, bike was broken, couldn't see he could see his team car up the road, thought, I'll just hop into this team car and get a lift 100 or 300 metres. I mean, we still don't know the actual, but they had to take that hard line, and because it was Nibali, really, they had to take the firmest line they possibly could.
Oh, exactly. As the Tour de France winner in 2014, one of the major figureheads of the sport, particularly representing a country like Italy, where he has revived interest in cycling to a large extent, but as you say, Lionel, you think about the way this is going to be covered by the media, the way it's going to be used by social media, how ridiculous, Rob, you said it looked. It was almost comical. It was funny. He does have to be made an example of to a certain extent. The one thing I would say in Nibali's favour is that, generally speaking, I know there's debates about whether he should be riding for Astana and the problems Astana's had with doping scandals and Nibali's position on doping generally. Vincenzo Nibali has been a pretty good role model, I think, for the sport for the most part over the past few years, and I think we should probably bear that in mind before we vilify him and demonise him too much.
Yeah, you're a seasoned Vincenzo Nibali watcher, I know, Daniel, and you've got a lot of information on his movements throughout the year, very much as well thanks to one of our esteemed colleagues over in Italy, who I'm sure everybody knows what I'm talking about. Do you think that it is going to affect his reputation? Because he does have quite a positive reputation around the world of cycling, certainly in Italy, certainly outside of Italy as well. Look back to the Tour last year, he was flying the flag for answering questions straight. He wasn't hiding behind any sort of masks or anything with the doping question. Yeah, of course, his choice of team can be questioned perhaps, but he's a guy who people generally like to watch racing as well. Whenever he turns up for a race, whether he has the form or not, he'll always try and contribute in a positive way. Is yesterday's incident going to affect his reputation?
I think there are a few things. I mean, he's certainly not done any favours by the fact that in an interview at Sestriere in the build-up to the Vuelta, he was asked about his relationship with Chris Froome, and he pointed out that Froome was thrown out of the 2010 Giro d'Italia for holding on to a police motorbike, and yet there he is a week later doing ostensibly exactly the same thing, being kicked out of the Vuelta. That doesn't look particularly good. The second thing to say is that the footage was so shocking, so comical, so slapstick that it will be around for a long time, and it will haunt Nibali to a certain extent. I think, on the other hand, I suspect, and other people have speculated about this morning, that this could lead to a further deterioration in Nibali's relationship with Astana. He's come out in La Gazzetta dello Sport this morning and suggested that he wasn't really being supported at the Vuelta. People were only interested in his team. People in his team were only really interested in Fabio Aru yesterday and finding out where he was and what problems he'd had after the crash. So the tension that we suspected already existed between, for instance, Nibali and Alexander Vinokurov, the team manager. Did Vinokurov send him as punishment to the Vuelta a Espana? We don't know. But that tension could be certainly exacerbated by what happened yesterday. That could possibly lead to discussions about Nibali's future at Astana. He's got a contract next year, 2016, but we remember during the Tour de France, he certainly talked to other people in the peloton about having had approaches from other teams. I think BMC were interested at that point. Should he leave Astana, then, we all know the image that Astana fairly or unfairly have in professional cycling, the criticism they've had, the criticism Nibali's had for remaining with that team. Were he to leave Astana, perhaps that would help his image ultimately. Certainly in some people's eyes. I'm not saying that's necessarily justifiable, but that might happen.
Well, let's come back to the Vuelta towards the end of the episode and have a look now at some of the other things that have been going on in the world of professional cycling. Rob mentioned at the start you've been watching the US Pro Challenge stage race in Colorado, won by Rowan Dennis of the BMC racing team, but probably most notable for a pretty spectacular return to racing for Taylor Phinney, who's had a really torrid 15 or 18 months or so.
Yeah, that horror crash at the National Championship, 16 months out, came back, won on his first stage of the USA Pro Challenge. As a Colorado native as well, that's going to be a very, very special win to him. We talked briefly about that last week, but on yesterday's final stage on the Sunday, he almost did it again. In the sprint in Denver, the Mile High City, it was a chaotic sprint in the end. There probably weren't enough sprinters teams in the race to make sure that it was controlled and safe and enough firepower really to set up a big lead out. Certainly around the narrow streets, the big 90-degree turns that you get racing in the United States as well, with the sort of grid-style layout of the cities. He came around that final corner, took the shortest line, had a right or go, but it was United Healthcare. They were trying to get Kyle Reinen, the man who won the points jersey, in to the position where he could sprint, but in the end it was John Murphy, the former national criterium champion of the United States, 30-year-old rider who's been there or thereabouts. He's raced on different teams. He's a pretty good acquisition for United Healthcare to race on those North American circuit races. He won the stage, but it meant that Taylor Phinney picked up yet another second place for BMC. They've won 4 stages out of 7 at that race. Rowan Dennis winning 2 of them, taking the overall, as well as highlighting how good BMC were at that race. Unfortunately, on a negative side, I think it also highlighted how little competition there was this year. Just 4 World Tour teams.
This is the Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Join us on Twitter and Facebook. Just search online for the Cycling Podcast.
And we're talking about the US Pro Challenge really because World Tour riders have won races there. Taylor Phinney, of course, his big comeback, and because it was on TV and people had the opportunity to watch it. I think one of the really interesting things about professional cycling, as it's trying to attract more people and, let's not beat around the bush, trying to attract more money, more investors, I just think that the sport is spread too thin. There's too much of it on, and it's difficult to kind of know what's leading to what point. What do you reckon, Daniel?
No, I mean, it does. It ties in, doesn't it, with what we were saying earlier about the sport, this desperate effort to sell itself, grow the pie. But there is this idea that, well, perhaps that, you know, cycling has ideas above its station. We see how many people have taken up the sport. We see how much money is coming to the sport on a recreational level, and there is a conviction that professional cycling ought to be reflecting that more than it is at the moment, rather than growing slightly more organically, perhaps.
I certainly think that the time slot for us here in the UK makes the US Pro Challenge, an appealing watch, because it's on in the evening, and you know, all right, it's late evening, but it was an appealing time to sit down and watch something. Whereas if you're busy in the day and you're out at the weekend, you know, catching up with the Vuelta when it's on, you know, 8 o'clock on a Saturday evening, most people are going out for the evening, aren't they? They're not going to be necessarily sat in front, and it's dinner time for us. It might not be in Spain, but certainly in the rest of Europe, a lot of Europe, you know, people are sitting down for their evening meal.
Yeah, in defence of the USA Pro Challenge, I think it's had a lot better start lists in the last few years. I think that's the 3rd year that I've covered the race, and I thought this year was going to be its big year. North American World Championships, and I just thought that a few teams would go over there, perhaps even more. I thought this maybe would be the year that the Vuelta suffered a little, just because we have all these races in North America now. The Tour of Alberta's coming up in Canada. Before the USA Pro Challenge, we had Utah, which is not quite at the same level, but again, another bit of racing. And the altitude as well. Yesterday we had a sprint stage, the Mile High City, 1,600 metres, and that was the lowest stage of the whole race. We were going up the Independence Pass, 2 days running, 3,690 metres, I think. Ridiculous sorts of altitudes, and if you can have a training camp up there, whether you're racing or not, sure, that's a different way and a decent way of preparing for the World Championships. But 4 World Tour teams, only 16 teams in total taking part. I think the organisers are now at a crossroads. There's been some talk of them maybe selling the rights to the race onto another company, and perhaps somebody else having a go and trying to make it there. The terrain's certainly there. Perhaps we just got to be a bit more. I know we were trying to knock the Vuelta down for being a little too creative before, but in the USA Pro Challenge case, perhaps just be a little bit more creative. Find narrower roads that look better on the television, because these big, great highways of 5-6 lanes don't look fantastic on the TV. And of course, the aim of the game, certainly from my point of view in the television industry, is to sell the state of Colorado. That's who's paying for the race, and I'm sure there are better ways to show it off than showing big races on 6-7 lane motorways.
Absolutely, very interesting. I mean, again, races like this could also be a good place to experiment with different formats, rather than tricking up the type of terrain they go over and effectively having a race along the beachfront. Maybe experiment with a few different formats. Get away from the bunch starts and the time trial being really the only 2 types of format that we've got. I mean, it strikes me there's a lot of areas for growth there, but there's a lot of resistance too, and probably, you know, we poo-pooed the Vuelta's attempts here to make something different. The riders effectively made the decision by saying, look, we don't want to race on this because it's too dangerous. So I think, Daniel, you made a point on Twitter about, you know, the riders have really spoken and said anything too tricky, too tricksy, they're not going to give the green light to.
No, they don't want it, quite simply. But the procedures have to be improved, don't they? The liaisons between the riders' associations, the teams associations, the race organisers need to be revised. I think they are going to look at that but in terms of course inspection, course approval, it's not satisfactory because there have been a couple of incidents this year which have highlighted the fact that it's not rigorous enough, the process.
Right, well, let's cover a little bit of transfer news, Daniel. You love a bit of transfer gossip. What's the latest?
I'm a bit out of the loop, actually, because I'm preparing for a transfer of my own to Germany in a couple of days. However, one big move in the last few days, the last week or so, has been announced. That's Rigoberto Urán moving to the team we like to refer to on the podcast as Cannondale Garmin. Cannondale
Garmin, indeed. I mean, is that almost a swap move? Is Dan Martin going to end up at Ethics? Do we know this yet?
It has been heavily speculated, and we think it probably will happen, don't we? Dan Martin, of course, rode well in the second stage of the Vuelta yesterday on the uphill finish to Caminito del Rey. Urán, it will be interesting to see what Cannondale Garmin decide to do with him, because he has improved certainly as a time trialist. He has won time trials in the last couple of years at he won at the Giro last year, long time trial. But as far as his ambitions in general classification of Grand Tours are concerned, he still is very much on the outer edges of, well, what we talk about as the big four now. On the outside looking in, he hasn't really made any inroads. Certainly this year he rode a fairly indifferent Giro d'Italia and a fairly anonymous Tour de France as well, didn't he? And going back a few years, Johan Bruni, I think we've quoted this on the podcast before, suggested that Urán was by far the biggest talent in the world for stage races and for Grand Tours, but he hasn't really shown that yet, has he? And does he revert slightly to being more of a one-day rider, more of an Ardennes Classics rider, using that finishing sprint, finishing speed that he had early in his career and won quite a lot of races, one-day races or stages and stage races, or does he try to find that very delicate balance, which is obviously what he's tried to find over the last few years between climbing and time trialling, and somehow manage to pick off one of these Grand Tours, perhaps won a Giro or a Vuelta when the field happens to be slightly weaker, when Contador isn't there or Nibali isn't there. But yeah, it'd be very interesting to see, and it's certainly an addition that Cannondale Garmin needed to make. They've had a tricky season. They don't have any prolific winners in that team. So it's certainly something that they can base their team and their ambitions around over the next year or two.
Yeah, certainly losing Daniel Martin, as we all expect Cannondale Garmin will. It's not quite a like-for-like replacement, is it? Because Dan Martin is proven in the Ardennes Classics. He's won Liège-Bastogne-Liège. He's been very close at Flèche-Wallonne. He's had a bit of a nearly man season this year, but for just making decisions at slightly different times. He might have won a stage at the Tour de France at Cotteret, I think was probably his best chance. And even on the second stage of the Vuelta here, he's fourth place, I think, was he, just behind, just a little bit too far off. But again, perhaps an issue of timing, just delaying, not perhaps reacting at exactly the right time to pull off the win. Urán has been consistent on fairly rare occasions. I think when he was on the podium at the Giro, that was the best he's ridden, and he certainly isn't he hasn't got the same punch or kick that Dan Martin has got, certainly for the Ardennes, I wouldn't have thought.
No, I don't think so, but I do agree with Daniel that it's a good signing. He's going to bring something to the team. He's going to bring his time trial in, and just the fact that he's a racer. I think he's one of those guys, a bit like Nibali we talked earlier on. Even though he doesn't have the form, he'll always give it a go. We saw that in the Tour de France. We saw it in the Giro. He was pretty downright awful in both Grand Tours this year, I think it's safe to say, and he'll be the first to admit that. Next year will be an interesting one for him. Will next year be the year that maybe he steps down and thinks, well, I'll have a go at the Vuelta this year, I'll have a go at something else, and not bother setting my goals as high as perhaps the biggest of the names like Contador. I think he will want to do the Tour next year, because I know that Colombia are very keen on him being their main man for the Olympic Games. There's been this sort of war of regions again in Colombia. Antioquia, which is the region that Urán hails from, as opposed to Quintana hails from. And this big fight into who will be their main man for the Olympic road race. And I think looking at the course, most people are now seem to be throwing their eggs into the basket of Urán, who was obviously so close in London as well, raced really, really well there. And I think his big aim next year might be actually an Olympic gold medal, which is strange to talk about in cycling, because I think we've been saying in the last few weeks as well that, maybe with Mark Cavendish's return to the track, maybe the Brits sometimes are a little obsessed with Olympic medals in cycling, and perhaps Olympic medals in cycling aren't really that important. Certainly as important as they are in other sports, but next year I know that Uran might have the backing of the Colombia team, and it might be some chance to try and take a medal.
Well, he was very close in London in 2012. I mean, it clearly proved to be more important to Alexander Vinokurov, that gold medal, on that occasion.
It's clearly more important to Vinokurov, wasn't it? As you say, exactly as you say, Lionel. Exactly. You nailed that.
I've no idea what you're trying to imply or infer. I'm not sure which is the correct word there, imply or infer, but nobody's implying or inferring anything.
I know we've got news that's yet unconfirmed, but more or less, I'm assured, almost a done deal. Carlos Betancourt, who left Ager Desert the other day, he looks to be headed to Movistar. So that could be another sort of bit of climbing talent to replace quite a bit of outgoing climbing talent at Movistar. Some of it heading to Sky, of course.
Well, I mean, I remember being very impressed by Betancourt at Paris-Nice a couple of years ago. It was last year, wasn't it? Yep. 2014. Won a really good uphill finish. I can't remember where that was now. Is it?
The Moor of something, wasn't it?
The Moor of something. It was very, very steep, and he really powered away from everybody else. Looked very, very impressive, but then his season really derailed, and I mean, I don't know too much other than sort of what's knocked about in the press about, we were talking a little bit about sports people in general, the assumption that they are always sort of like computer game figures, 100%, and, they're always going to be focused, motivated, do they want it as much? It does strike me perhaps a slightly better fit with a Spanish-speaking team than perhaps with AG2R.
And it might give him a bit more liberty, really, to choose where he lives, where he trains. I know he likes to spend time at home in Colombia. He became a father for the first time this year as well, which is obviously going to have a big effect on what happens. And same with Nairo Quintana. Loves living at home in Colombia, loves training at home, loves being at altitude. Again, a young guy, but already a big family man. He's got children of his own as well. He's married and likes to spend as much time as possible at home.
Let's wrap up with a very quick summary of what we expect to happen in the Vuelta. Looking forward to the second full weekend of racing just ahead of the rest day. The first rest day will be on the Tuesday, so they've got quite a long stretch. We've already seen the GC battle kind of shake up. The names you would expect have moved to the fore. Rodriguez, Chris Froome, Aru's up there. Rob, what are you expecting to see, or what are you looking forward to over the next few days?
Visually, I'm looking forward to seeing the Alpujarras, the beautiful mountains south of Granada. Absolutely beautiful region that isn't talked about too much. It's not one of the main tourist hotspots, so that should be good to watch on the telly. There's going to be a couple of good uphill finishes there as well. There's only one guaranteed flat stage, and that's to Ronda, which is going to be another good spectacle on the telly, that famous white village in Andalusia, which I'm sure many of you who've been down there on your holidays might have had a good look at. I think it's going to be quite unpredictable as well. We saw on the first uphill stage a pattern emerging where we weren't quite sure who had what form coming out of the Tour, or after the long break after the Giro as well. Maybe different riders who we didn't think would be leaders emerging as possible leaders, and I think it wouldn't be surprising, if we at least saw one of the big guys just go pop in the first week, and somebody we might have been expected to be challenging for the top 5 in Madrid in 3 weeks' time, off the map and relegated to role of domestique.
Daniel?
Well, I think yesterday, the first Hilltop finish told us that Quintana is in good form, but we sort of expected that. Quintana is someone who climbs very well year-round. He never really falls badly out of form. Valverde was a bit of a surprise in the sense that it was a finish which looked very well suited to him, and he didn't go well at all. He said that he's in good form, so there'll be plenty more terrain for him to recoup what he lost yesterday. But I think Froome, we knew that he was slightly undercooked going into the Vuelta, but he limited his losses yesterday and will probably grow into the race. It may be that the big stage that we've all talked about to Andorra, it's been billed as the hardest stage ever in a Grand Tour, which comes just after the first rest day, so it's stage 11. That will be the big shake-up, I'm sure. That will be the one that will open up the big time gaps. And then I think the stage in the Sierra de Madrid, I think, is on the penultimate day, another big mountain stage. That will probably be the decider, but we might see the time gaps in the other stage, the other hilltop finishes, mountaintop finishes, being quite small, and the stages might turn out to be slightly anticlimactic.
Yeah, just lastly, I think on the Vuelta, I mean, again, when we talk about the course that the 3 Grand Tours lay down for the riders, there's again a sort of an assumption that they can really pick and choose, and there's so many factors that go into designing a race course, which regions want it and are willing to pay for it, and sometimes it's unavoidable but what I do like is that there isn't, as you say, Daniel, this block of like 3-4 big mountain stages all back to back, where really the pattern gets established, and then it's whether somebody is going to fall off. And you work out pretty early on who's climbing best and who's climbing second best and so on. That's something I've talked about before. The Giro, I think, had slumped into a bit of that at times with these savagely difficult final weeks. The pattern's already set, and then you just see the repeat of the same thing. And so when you mix up the types of climbs, you have something shorter, not necessarily as steep, something that suits the punchers a bit more, you see slightly more unpredictable results, and so you don't just get into the riders aren't able to just get into that rhythm which a lot of the GC guys want to get into. They want to know exactly what's coming up. They want to basically face the same challenge day after day, and I think that's what looks quite appealing about the route so far.
So they will know the climbs around there, but they'll never race up there in a peloton, and the tactics are different, and the race situations that can develop on the day, it could make fantastically interesting racing.
Well, let's leave it there, shall we? We'll watch the Vuelta unfold over the next few days. We'll be back. Well, I'll be back next week. Daniel, you'll be, I think, in Germany?
Yes, I'll be in Germany.
I mean, you will be back at some point.
Could be a few months.
Goodness me. I mean, we're going to have to get you on using the power of the internet on Skype to get your input, particularly as the transfers start to hot up. As the season winds down. Rob, we will no doubt catch up with you as well once you get back from your holidays. Richard Moore will be back next week to hold things together in his sort of stoic north of the border kind of way, rather than my rather sort of haphazard foot in mouth way that we've had this week. But I'm a little bit out of practice myself after a week off. So that all that leaves me to say is thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you, Lionel.
And thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Lionel.
Listening to the Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Thank you to Glass Pear for the music in this episode. For more information and to download more editions of the show, visit thecyclingpodcast.com.